regardless, and you sort of then continue on other things. And then at the end of the question, it's, what's your favorite color? And it's sort of blue, red, yellow, green, right? And then the people who didn't say blue, you know it means that they weren't really paying attention, right? And so there's debates about these, about how to use these. Basically, the general consensus is that you want to have a bunch of these rather than just one, and you don't want to throw out responses right away just because someone happened to not be paying attention with the one that's sort of less efficient. Sometimes people's attention sort of waxes and wanes over the course of the survey, but this is not just an Mturk thing, right? Sort of just survey research in general. Similarly, there's other work that, there's a new behavioral research methods piece that just came out suggesting that Mturk workers are actually more likely to pass these kinds of attention checks than participants in other survey platforms. But it's not just because they're already familiar with what's your favorite color question, but when you invent new attention checks, they're more likely to pass those as well. They're generally more likely to pay attention. Point number 2, second thing we didn't know about Mturk, at least I didn't know, is how many people out there are there? So there have been studies where what people have done, they've used methods from population ecology, the sort of capture-recapture method. So pretend you have like fish in a pond, and you like take fish out of the pond and you sort of throw them back, right? And then you're using this to see how many fish are in the pond. I don't know anything about fish, but I assume this is how it works, right? But in Mturk, basically, the sense is that the active Mturk population is about 7,300 workers. And about half the Mturk pool leaves and gets replenished about every 7 months or so. So what this means, though, is that there's about 7,300 people at any given point in time who are doing all of these academic experiments all at once, right? So this leads, I guess, to the next question, which is about naivete. So sometimes there are some paradigms with experiments and with studies where you want your participants to be naive, right? You don't want them to understand what the study is about, because if you do, then you're going to bias your results. Those studies, I think, are generally riskier doing on a platform like Mturk, where you tend to not have naive respondents, right? Because, so think of things like, how many of you guys have taken psychology classes, just out of curiosity? All right, so a bunch, so have you ever seen things like the cognitive reflection test, right, the CRT, right? These are well, I won't make you non-naive, but you can talk to me after. I won't say it on video and ruin everyone else's research forever, right? But there are these tests where if you already know what the answer is, then the questions aren't very good. And so those kinds of tasks, I think, generally, I get a little bit more concerned about when people are using those on Mturk. But on the other hand, if it's novel research, and I mean, what research isn't novel, right? But if you're sort of doing things that people haven't done before, or there are the kinds of tasks where that's less of an issue, then I think that's okay. The other thing that you can also do with Mturk, this is, I don't know, are we up to number 4 or something?
3, I think.
Number 3?
Yeah.
Okay. So you can also pre-screen workers. And you can grant workers qualifications. And so this has a couple of tricks that I think maybe this can be a compound like 3 through 5. Okay. So first trick thing, what you can do, you can build a panel. So you have people who participate in your study at time t, right? Then you have another study at time t plus 1. If it's the same study and you don't want people taking both, you can screen people out, right? So you grant a qualification to people who have previously taken the first task, and this way they're not in your pool, they can't even see it when it comes up on the list. And this way you're preventing contamination. So that's one way of doing it. But the other thing that this, I guess, is point number whatever, right? Is that if you want to make your sample more representative, then you can use information from previous, you can grant qualifications, use information from previous studies as a way of doing it. So for example, I presented a paper here this morning, sort of the morning, afternoon maybe, where we were interested in how people think about terrorism, and we anticipated in advance that there would be these differences between liberals and conservatives. And in general, there's a sense that conservatives are underrepresented on Mturk. So what we did is we found people who, previous studies that we had done, sort of unrelated, that we knew that they were conservative from there, and we targeted them as well as a way to, so we oversampled on this characteristic that we thought was important to us as a way to end up with more diversity in terms of this characteristic. So that's something else that you can do as well. And now that said, with generalizability, so I don't know how many of you guys have seen this. Maybe this is point number 5 or something. But if you've seen Andy Gelman's Xbox study, you know that people are doing really cool things with survey weights, such that a lot of these other questions are kind of questions. So if you try to think about like, what's the world's least representative group of people, the answer would be people who play Xbox, right? In the sense that they're mostly, guys, right, under the age of 25. I don't know. It's sort of a skewed group. But what Gelman and some co-authors did is, so they took these Xbox users, and they found that they were able to predict sort of even like subgroup level election results at a very sort of fine level, based solely on these Xbox users, right? Even though there's not a huge, basically if you know what the characteristics are that matter, right, you can weight on these characteristics as a way to sort of figure out what's going on. And that's sort of an extreme case, and they had a giant sample, I think they had like 90,000 people or something, in order to make it work. But the point is that just because one group looks different from another group on certain characteristics doesn't necessarily mean that it's a problem for research, right? Based upon if you know what the characteristics are, right? But also thinking about ways of coping with it. Similarly, there's this new piece Jamie Druckmann has in Sage Open, where it sounds a little bit like a BuzzFeed article. In its title, it's like something like, survey firms hate these 9 simple tricks that you can use to sort of make Mturk work, right? But basically, what they find is that there are 9 variables that even for doing survey research, once you control for these 9 things, and these things are age, gender, race/ethnicity, income, education, marital status, religion, ideology, and partisanship, that basically you end up with the same effect size, the same effects as you would in a nationally representative sample. So this is survey research too. It's not even experiments, right? And what's interesting about this too is it sort of suggests things like normally I think when we think about Mturk workers, we don't think about marital status as one of the covariates we should be really concerned about. But this research seems to suggest that once you control for that, good things happen. So the other thing too, and so this I think speaks nicely to something that Professor Settle was talking about. So when you take a study on Mturk, you know who is sponsoring the study. So there's interesting work that's being done on the sponsorship effects in Mturk. And so there's some grad students at Harvard who have this cool paper where they're interested, they manipulate the race and gender of the account that is sponsoring the study, basically, showing that there's social desirability biases that manifest them. So if you are doing a study on sort of racial attitudes and the names of the scholars in the IRB form are names that you sort of associate with African Americans, say, then people are less likely to sort of reveal racial prejudices than they would if they're names that are sort of stereotypically associated with Caucasians, right? Same with gender effects. And so in this sense, those sort of sponsorship effects, I think there's sort of people doing interesting work about this. Something else too has to do with, so if you get a study and it's being advertised by a university, right, does that change how you react, the kind of answers that you give compared to if the study has a non-academic sponsor? The answer there so far seems to be no, not really, but I think it's still early on and people are still sort of thinking about some of these. The last thing I want to say, so I know I talked about conservatives earlier, so there I think every time there's a big political science conference in Chicago every year called Midwest, and every year at Midwest there's always some sort of paper about like, whether it's okay to study conservatives on Mturk or not, and basically this question of whether the kinds of conservatives who are willing to sort of do an Mturk study online systematically differ from conservatives writ large in America. And there's a neat piece that just came out of Research in Politics that basically suggests that liberals and conservatives on Mturk have the same psychological characteristics as the liberals and conservatives in the mass public. So in other words, it's not that there's something inherently weird about the Mturk conservatives compared to the regular ones, say. The other things too, there's some grad students at Harvard who are doing interesting things about, so let's say you post a hit online for a study. What they're looking at is, does the time at which you post the hit make a difference, right, in terms of the kind of people that you get? And the study's sort of super early on, so it's hard, we don't know what the answer is yet. But do people who, I know there's kind of folk wisdom amongst researchers, right? Oh, well, like don't post it on the weekend because, the weekend is different than people who take these studies in the week. Or you want to sort of do it at it's sort of like the same strategy with like posting Craigslist ads, right? Like post it in the morning so that this way, people see it and it's not at the, anyways. So there's work being done on that too. But the bottom line is that there's a lot of people who are doing this kind of research now. And as a result, there's a lot of kind of meta Mturk research being done, which is exciting, right? Because it's a way to understand sort of what the limitations are and aren't with this sort of thing. The other final point, I know I said I had one final point, but you've inspired me. I have another final point. which is that Mturk is useful for things that aren't not beyond surveys and experiments, and that there's a lot of interest in crowdsourcing research more generally. There are some political scientists at NYU who are interested in basically crowdsourcing text analysis, right? So if you think about something like the Party Manifestos project, where you have all of these political party platforms and in different countries from different parties, and you want to understand sort of what we should make about these different tenets, right? So you give people fragments of this text, and you have them coded on the dimensions that you're interested in, and then you use machine learning techniques as a way of aggregating the answers together as a way to then sort of map the parties into this different dimensional space. So even though Mturk is sort of useful for survey research, it's useful for experimental research, I think it's also useful for other kinds of research as well. There's other kinds of crowdsourcing beyond sort of simply sort of being a kind of a participant in that sense. But I will stop there.
I counted 17.5 points, which is really quite good. All right, Professor Maliniak.
Sure, batting cleanup. Thanks so much for those introductory. Now you have the main show. No, mine's going to be a lot shorter, I think. I'm also sort of speaking from an IR comparative side of things. I'm not an Americanist. I'm mostly interested in things in other countries. And so I think when I conventionally thought about IR when I was an undergraduate at William & Mary, I never thought of how I was going to use something like Mturk, or I'd be able to do experiments, because lots of times you're talking about nuclear proliferation. And so if you want to know if nuclear proliferation is a good or bad thing, like you could randomly start giving countries nuclear weapons, and you have a experimental or treatment group and a control group, and see which one causes the end of the world first. But there are huge IRB complications with that, as it turns out. So I think Mike Deschennes was the person back then, and he would not let that study go. Ray's here, so good.
I'm the chair of the committee right now.
Now, yes, we've met before. Luckily, I've not tried to run that through. So I've just got myself blacklisted for all experiments in the future. But I think Mturk, one of the big things is how it has played out in experiments and has actually sort of accompanied this big turn towards experiments in IR and comparative politics. And a lot of this has come not because of survey experiments, but because of field experiments. So people going out there in the field, in countries, trying to randomize certain elements about political information and seeing if they can improve governance outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. There was some work in IR where people were using where election monitors, like international election monitors, were showing up at polling stations as sort of a random treatment and seeing if that had an effect on whether or not the poll results looked a little more real in certain situations. So lots of people started to get very interested in experiments because of sort of the power and the interesting causal inference. And there was also a turn towards public opinion in IR. And so this was an obvious area in which we take some insights from comparative and American politics and apply them. So that's why experiments, I think, started to take off. But early on, I think there was a bit of a resource constraint. So the problem was you either had to be a professor at a big university with a large research budget to go out there and field an experiment in which you had lots of people going and knocking on doors and randomizing this or that and getting some data and coming back and then publishing in the top journals, or you had to be a lucky graduate student who was a student of some big professor or was at some really big university. And so there were these huge startup costs that were almost impossible to overcome. And then we get this thing at Stanford, the knowledge network stuff, which allows some people to get very low cost access to online surveys, and the ball starts rolling and some IR people really start thinking about how to do survey stuff. And I think that Mturk, one of the things it did was leveled the playing field because it's fairly inexpensive. So it allowed a lot of people who had ideas that could potentially be tested with experiments to actually engage in those things. And not just grad students, like undergraduates at a place like the College of William & Mary could actually go out there and do an experiment in a way that would have been prohibitively costly in the past. So this led, in my sort of vision of what the IR discipline looked like, to a bit of an explosion of experiments, right? So there was an overcorrection. Everyone said, you know what's a lot easier than recoding every single war since 1945 for some specific variable and running my large regression on it? I should just run an experiment, and I will just keep running experiments until I find something cool because it's so inexpensive. Now, it's become, we've moved in the other direction. At least that's sort of a view that some people take of what happened. So I think there was an explosion of survey experiment style papers being submitted at these conferences like Midwest and the American Political Science Association conference, etc. I'm sure Ray probably sees now survey experiments every other day, and half of them are from people on this panel. So there's a lot coming through. And I think that ended up with a different problem. So early on, it was incredibly costly to do these experiments, especially because if you didn't have the money to really do a great job of pre-testing and figuring out exactly how your treatment was going to work so that you hopefully found something when you went out there, then you go out and do an experiment, you spend thousands upon thousands of dollars, you get the data back, you start analyzing it, and then you have that cold sweat moment where you have this pain in your stomach and you say, oh no, I may have spent $20,000 or more, and there's no result. And that's really scary because, yes, you potentially wasted lots of money or spent lots of money. I won't say wasted, you learned something, but it turns out that no one cares about that thing you learned. And that's just something about academia in general. But you're also maybe like, that was going to be my dissertation, and my funding's going to run out, and what is my family going to eat? I mean, there are lots of questions that data not working out could potentially cause you to ask, and they're not fun ones to answer. So this may have led to some people saying, well, maybe there's not the effect I hypothesized. But what if there is some effect amongst some small subgroup, and that might be interesting. So after you look for the thing that you were hoping was there and then isn't there, you start saying, but you know what? I bet that this might work amongst Republicans and not Democrats, and that's the problem. I didn't see it before, but now I see it. That's what's going on. So you run your t-test in a slightly different way, and then you start saying, okay, it didn't work, but you know what it really is? It's actually Southern Republicans, right? So there's something different about them, and you know, so you say, I run it that way, and you're like, it didn't quite work, but that p-value is getting close. So what if we look at Southern Republicans that are only in cities between 35,000 and 75,000 people, and then bam, stars all over, I found it, I have this great, I just got to tweak the theory a little bit, and I have some cool finding, and I can write it up and publish it. So this is how you think, thank goodness, everything's going to be okay. But the truth is, everything's not okay, right? People started to see a lot of results that sort of look this way, and the problem with looking for these heterogeneous treatment effects is that we know that even when we're 95% confident, that 1 out of 20 times we're going to find a result that's significant. So if you just start cutting the data in random ways, theoretically, you will find something that is significant. I guarantee it. I've done it before. But it may not be statistically valid in a true sense, and it may be that this finding, if were replicated, would have been overturned. And we're concerned because I don't know what's in the head of the researcher. So maybe the person who did that study, in their head said, really, I'm doing this whole study just to see if Republicans in urban southern cities between 35,000 and 70,000, if they have the effect that I think they will. If that's truly what they were looking for, then bravo, well done, they found it. But if not, I can't truly know all the different tests that they did where they didn't find a result. So I think that that's particularly problematic. And because surveys used to be so expensive, this led to people, I worry, being more likely to try to publish things of that nature. So how do we get around that? I think Mturk has actually helped us because it comes in as a low-cost alternative. You are not supposed to go fishing for results, but you are allowed to go fishing in a place where you found fish before. To continue on the fishing references, which I know nothing about fishing. I assume if you fish in one place and there are fish there, there will be fish there again. So if this reference doesn't work for those who know fishing, feel free to let me know. But the idea being is like, let's say you do cross-cut. If it truly is the case that Republicans in these small cities are the actual place where the action's going and you have a theory that fits, you can then go back and look for that in an additional survey, right? And potentially, if you're worried about all these things that people claim that Mturkers aren't representative, although there's lots of evidence that they are, especially if you control for these various factors, you don't have to potentially waste the money you would on a big nationally representative sample. You can test these things earlier with Mturk and then go out there and sort of look for them. And this brings it into the whole pre-registration sort of movement that's going on right now. To prevent people from going out there and fishing for results, what you do is you say ahead of time, here are the analyses I plan to do, and I will report them either way, and I'm tying my hands so you know that I haven't gone on some fishing expedition. I'm going to produce you results that you should care about. It also prevents you from having to do everything that the reviewers say you have to do, right? So every time somebody sees your paper, just like when Professor Kertzer presented this, he had myself and all of my colleagues saying, well, what if you run it this way? And I wonder if you looked at just Republicans who also thought that this treatment worked that way. And he kindly said, oh, sure, yeah, I'll go home and look at that. But the other answer could be, no, I'm not going to do that, because that would be fishing for results. And we're not 100% sure, even if I found something there, that it would truly be valid. So it sort of helps there in tying your hands. So I think one of the great things about Mturk is that it has actually lowered the cost for doing this type of research. And it means that all the types of things that only being at a high level are correlated with, by that I mean being at like a large research institution or one of the top sort of Ivy League places, or the places that are likely to get grants, all the things that are correlated with that for good and bad reasons, we potentially can get away from with things like Mturk. So that's my ethical argument, is why Mturk is probably a good thing.
Wow, thank you very much. All right, fantastic comments from all of the panelists. We only have about 16 minutes, and I assume that there are questions in the audience. Are there questions in the audience, maybe? Okay, at least a couple. Let me throw one question out to the panelists, and then we will open it up and collect a couple questions and have you guys reflect individually on those. I want to talk about exploitation. So some of you, and I'm putting my ethicist hat on because our philosophy colleague couldn't be this. I'm going to pretend to be a philosophy professor. Some of you mentioned the idea of one argument against Mturk being that it could be deemed as exploitive in a couple different ways, one of which is you have people responding to surveys for very little money. And one potential outcome of that is you have this sort of race to the bottom where people on Mturk are bidding essentially lower and lower amounts of money to do projects that are requiring their effort. So they're not living, presumably at a living wage, although I guess if they do enough of these, they could, but assume maybe they're not getting a living wage from it. Researchers are benefiting at good, wealthy schools like Harvard and William & Mary and collect good salaries and all the rest of it on the backs of people who are making very little. So with that sort of strong argument of exploitation, I'm just curious how the panelists would respond to it, if at all. And you can either respond to it right now, or I could take other questions before you respond.
You can address it.
Okay.
I'm happy to talk about it. So I think one of the hardest things is figuring out how to set a rate that addresses this notion of continuing it's an affordable way to collect data. So keeping it in that realm while being respectful of the time of the subjects that you have. And so the problem is that everyone takes a different amount of time to do a task. And the way Mturk works is that they are paid on completion, and everyone gets, it's not an hourly, you're not paying them for the actual amount of time they spend, you are paying them for completing the task. And so some people are very fast. So when you're fielding a new study, you try to get people to take it ahead of time, so you have some sense for how long it's going to take. You get some sense for the mean and median amount of time, and then you set a price based on that, and then you send it out into the world, and it turns out there's huge variation between people, right? And some people are really fast, and some people take forever. So some people are making a really good hourly rate if they're able to complete your task quickly, and some are not. And I think the hardest thing is just figuring out how to do that, setting it appropriately. So that's from our side of it. I think on the other side of it, there are two problems. So one is that I don't know this, but my impression is that the mechanical Turk worker community is a strong sense of community that is actively lobbying Amazon for certain policies and rule changes. And so Amazon is like the third party here that's just facilitating the interaction between the two. So the Turkers have things they want that Amazon's not necessarily implementing, but the Turkers don't have a great way to communicate with those of us who are fielding the studies, right? And apart from these forums or apart from people emailing you and saying, no, this is not appropriate. So for example, this email I got saying that even though he spent the amount of time on the hit that was appropriate, he wasn't angry that it had taken him longer than was advertised, he was angry because our rate of pay wasn't high enough. And he pointed me towards one of these forums buried on the internet and said, here's here's what Turkers say they should be paid for their time. Well, when I signed up for the Amazon service, Amazon didn't tell me that. Amazon never steered me towards it. I'm not part of the Turker community, and so it's only by someone pointing this out to you that you then go back and learn. So I think part of this issue is communication issues, and that every group here has slightly different stakes.
Okay.
There's also Vanessa Williamson, who's I think she might still be a grad student at Harvard. But so she has this piece on the ethics of Mturk recruitment, where it's sort of like an ethnography of Mturk workers, where she sort of went out and interviewed people and sort of met with them. And the argument that she makes is sort of twofold. So first of all, that you should set a sort of a minimum wage for your own research, right, which oftentimes ends up being above what sort of standard going rates in MTurk are. And this is good for you as a researcher anyways, because more people are likely to want to participate because you're paying more, right? She also says that one possibility then is that if you're worried about this kind of the distorting effect it has on other people's research, then you can pay your workers retroactively through bonuses to bring them up after in a way that doesn't distort the market. But either way, one of the points that she makes is that we were talking about grants earlier, right? That there should be sort of space built into sort of grant-making institutions. The institutions could require that if you're going to be using this money on MTurk, you have to pay participants an ethical amount, right? And so this is some of the ways that I think people are starting to think about it. But check out her stuff, because I think it sort of taught me things I hadn't thought about before.
Mm-hmm. Good. Dan?
I mean, I think it's a perfectly valid point and an important one to think about. But I wonder too, with those in the experimental community, when many of them are doing sort of experiments, actual field experiments and survey experiments in sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia or the Caucasus, those types of experiments are also paying often quite low rates and could potentially have real consequences other than the nasty email, like they could actually end up with the overthrow of a government or things like that. So for me, it's a funny place to pitch this battle as like, gosh, you should spend 50 cents more an hour. Well, that's not to denigrate it, but it's just within the space of thinking about treating your survey and subjects really well. I think there are other places we probably could spend more time and get more bang for our ethical buck.
I think that's fair. Okay, I'd like to take questions from the audience if we have any. All right, why don't we start here and then we'll work. Maybe we'll take 2 or 3 and have the panelists take them as a group.
Have any of you introduced your students to Mturk and had them create surveys as a class project?
Excellent question. And the 2 up here?
I was curious about this last point about kind of p-hacking across Mturk studies and how you would reasonably control for that. Because I could see running into this problem where you have, well, first you have the researcher degrees of freedom problem where you're developing all these post-hoc ideas and they go on. How do you pare those down to something reasonable and theoretically resonant with whatever you're studying? And then how do you look at these across some, like what would be the criteria, the number of studies that you would examine? Because I could see getting into this like meta p-hacking where you're just like, oh, I'll look at this other Mturk study. Well, it's not right there. So this other, like, what would that framework look like?
Okay, excellent. And then,
I have a more logistical question. What have you guys done to try, or if you have tried to bypass this new commission fee increase? I think they increased it from 20% to 40% if you have over 9 unique workers. So I'm trying to figure out this bypass right now to try and run a Mturk study. And I know they have various third-party resources that tap into the Amazon API user interface. So I'm wondering if you guys have any experience with that.
all right, we'll take 1 more and then we'll have the panelists. Yeah.
Mine was, I think, for a comment that Jaime mentioned that it was a little bit contradictory. You had mentioned, I think, that Mturk workers had a particularly good sense of what their time was worth. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, someone had mentioned before that they also had low self-esteem and whatnot. So if you use that data to figure out, whatever, is it a race to the bottom? Are you sort of sampling the bottom population of what they think their time is worth, and then adjusting to that.
4 very good and diverse
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah.
I just say before you answer that last one, remember I raised my hand when you asked who had been on Mturk.
Oh, yeah,
So
yeah.
just answer it in that,
Okay.
with that in mind.
Okay. We have pep talks to help you raise yourself,
Right,
student.
I know.
All right, so the class projects, yes. So I actually have a student sitting over here who has used Mechanical Turk. In my research lab, I work with students to find sort of a mutual meeting of interests and run studies that are related to things I'm interested in, but customized to what the students are interested in. It's been great. I think if I do a senior seminar again, I would love to be able to do that. And I think if you're doing it for pedagogical purposes, you really want to be mindful of these ethical issues, right? Because that becomes part of the experience of doing it. But I think it's very well suited to that. So, do you guys want to add anything on that point?
How do you pay for it? How do the students pay for it? They can do it.
So right now it's my funding, so like grants that I have that have paid for it. So William & Mary's great about giving students funding, right? And so you can, if you're doing an honors thesis or a summer research project, you're getting money, and that money can be used for research purposes, and so presumably it could be used. I actually did have a student do a side project that I believe he paid for out of his pocket on mechanical. Well, he'd gotten money from the college, paid out of pocket, but used that money applied. Yeah.
On sort of some of the questions. So on the fee surcharge. So I mean there are ways so you can batch process it. So instead of having one survey with 900 people, you have 91 surveys with 8 people, right? And there are ways to automate it. I've never done it, but I also haven't fielded all that many since they changed the price structure. I mean, also too, when Amazon changed that fee structure, what ended up happening is that there's other platforms that are. I mean, we've been sort of using Mturk as synonymous with crowdsourced research, right? There's other platforms available out there that have different fee structures as well that I haven't used, but I mean, they also. It's not clear to me that that Amazon will sort of maintain this monopoly sort of foreseeable future. I don't know, have you guys?
I've used a couple of the other ones, specifically with the goal of trying to get a more international audience. And it turns out there's just not enough users on most of these other places, at least to get a good size sample. But you can cut down the cost, but you have to wait 10 weeks to get your 150 responses, and it's really slim pickings. So until those types of things get more popularity, I think it's going to be tough to compete with Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
And there are so many moving pieces to get this right. I mean, this notion of the timing, right? So my collaborator and I early on made a decision that we only launch things Monday mornings because we didn't know, right? And we wanted to be able to compare across studies, and we said, whatever funky thing is going on, at least we're getting the same funky thing going on if we launch it every Monday morning. So then you start thinking about breaking your survey into 90 studies that you're now all launching, right? And then you would need to screen out people so that you're not getting the same, and it just became too much. I think we didn't face enough of a funding constraint on that project to say we need to find the workarounds and do it. But I could see it being worthwhile. I would just be mindful of the fact that the Turkers are going to be talking, right? Like they're not going to be totally oblivious to the fact of what workaround you may be trying to do to address that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to the p-hacking point, I mean, to some degree, we have to evaluate these things by the theory. So people who come up with completely ad hoc theories that don't make sense to try to explain relationships, that will be a problem, right? I mean, lots of these experiments, I think, sometimes are so thin on the theory, and that's where they potentially get in trouble, or the theory seems too good, and in some cases it is. So therein lies on the flip side, though, your statement about meta p-hacking, I mean, if the same result is holding in many different studies, I think that probably means something. Like, it probably is there, and it's less problematic if you can replicate it in the future. So I really think like the answer to your question is not so much the ad hoc theorizing, but can we bring in theory to sort of help explain some of these results in a more systematic way? Because at the end of the day, I think it is just tough to just publish something that is simply a correlation in one experiment without any theory behind it.
Yeah, and I would add, even if you are not officially pre-registering a study, I think essentially pre-registering it with yourself, right? And saying like these, so grants in many ways are essentially that, right? Like you're sort of committing an outline of what you're planning to do, or the systematic way you're going to go about extending the results you've already done. And so, to the degree you can bind yourself to that, I think that can help a lot too.
Yeah, I mean, we can chat more about the p-hacking stuff after, because I have lots of strong opinions. But I think I'll go. Yeah, I think the point about theory is really sort of well taken here, right? That just the act of sort of designing, like a well-designed experiment takes a long time to think out, right? And if you're sort of spending all this time doing it, I mean, sort of thinking, pre-registering with yourself even, right? Just sort of thinking, what exactly am I looking for? How am I testing it, right? I mean, the question of how binding this stuff is tricky, because then you sort of send stuff to reviewers, and reviewers sort of simultaneously say, I want you to test for these like 20 other things, but also I'm worried about multiple comparisons, right? But so I mean, to the extent to which who's being bound is, I guess, another question. But I think it's the thinking sort of in a meta perspective about it is useful.
And on this last one here about the contrast of the value of time versus how self-esteem might play into that, it's a great point. I mean, I think that is potentially a contradiction. I was thinking more in terms of the fact, like, I actually have no idea how much I make an hour, right? I know what my salary is. I know I work a lot, but I have I could not tell you with any precision. Whereas I think people on Mechanical Turk do have a very good sense.
Sort of granular aspect.
A granular aspect of like, what is it that I'm actually doing with my time? Now, that does still run into a problem with this potential race to the bottom of like, how little is my time, or how little am I willing to work for? And if it is a population that differs in some of these psychological characteristics, you may get a deflated sense of that. But even this study, even trying to generalize back, not in a generalizability sense, but just thinking about what it means, we're going to show a difference in that, yes, people need more money to talk about politics with people they disagree with and people they agree with, right? We can quantify that. That's not, that tells, doing more, it's more complicated than that, right? That tells us something interesting, but it's not like that in and of itself is going to play out in the real world. But I think from a sort of behavioral econ point of view of using that sort of approach, I think it can be worthwhile.
I think Ray should get a question. Ray.
Thank you. From the Protection of Human Subjects Committee's role here is certainly to protect all the subjects that you interact with. Mm-hmm. And I'm just always worried about it. And I'm just worried that a parent is going to say, my 13-year-old has been spending all their time making a nickel here and a nickel there, okay, doing these surveys, because I'm not giving them any more allowance, and they're going to make their own money, okay? And that's just a number, okay? Mm-hmm. Is there any way to protect that you know who is doing your talking? Can we get the 17 and 13-year-olds not to do your studies? I just am afraid that parents lawyers are going to come to William & Mary and say, you can't do this. That's not right. That's not fitting to the federal guidelines. And so every time I approve one of these studies, I hope it doesn't come back and hit me, so can we talk to that?
So my sense is, I'll defer to all the wisdom in the room about this, but my sense is that Amazon has made it increasingly difficult both for requesters and for workers to register on the site. Whenever I have co-authors who are sort of registering as a requester, certainly, like there's this constant back and forth with, like, Amazon doesn't accept faxes. They only want faxes of like certain documentation for tax purposes, and same on the side of the workers, right? That it makes it it's harder to sign up. now in terms of the documentation you have to provide in order to participate. My understanding is that I think it would be hard for a minor to do so because the documentation would show that they were minors, so they wouldn't be allowed to. But I'm curious what.
I didn't know, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah.
If there was some documentation, does anybody know that there's other documentation like that?
Yeah, they check all sorts of documents about your history. They like check your tax records if you let them. And like after you make a they require you to either give them access to some like documents about your financial history or stop. And so anybody over a certain level of like expertise will have to have provided these documents, and so they have to be over a certain age.
Yeah, that's reassuring to me. I mean, I've always assumed that, the consent form clearly asks it, and that we do that to protect subjects, but if subjects are lying to us, the college is protected because,
Maybe.
yeah,
Right, that's illegal.
yeah.
And I think also that this documentation has also made it harder for people in other countries as a result to participate, or to work on Mturk.
Yeah, I think for a while that was the concern, is that it was truly the Wild West. A 13-year-old or somebody in somewhere in South Asia was taking your survey, and like that was the claim, that how do you know any of the people taking your survey are actually the representative sample of Americans that you claim them to be? But that changed. In fact, I was trying to do a survey where we were focusing on people outside the U.S. And we couldn't anymore. I mean, it was like, gosh, I really want, and I was worried people just weren't admitting that they were in a different country. It just became hard. But I think Amazon's incentive is to keep it legitimate. Like, they both don't want to get sued, and they don't want this thing to stop, right? They do not want all of us researchers to say, our IRB folks to say, sorry, you can't do this anymore because we're not certain. So I really think they have a strong incentive, which is not actually a good answer to say, I'm telling you, Amazon's corporate responsibility is where I'm going to put my money. But I mean, it's better than nothing.
I've talked to the HHS about these type of things, and they say they bring it back down and let our committee decide these type of things. But I'm just always worried about that. I mean, they even say there's no signed consent form. All right, I want to get a signed consent form. Just because they're going online doesn't mean you can't get a signed consent form, because you can send the consent form to them, they can sign it, they can scan it, and send it back to you. All right, so when everybody keeps asking for Mturk and they waive the signed consent form, I'm also nervous. All right, so because I want your research to go on, I want to, but again, I don't want the college to get sued. Right? So you may see me say, oh no, you have to do a signed consent form for every person doing Mturk. All right, is that possible?
No.
I don't even know.
No, because we don't.
Are they allowed to send you something to your email account? A signed consent form?
I don't think we can contact them preempt. Well,
No, they would you send it out there, and if they would like to conduct your study, the requirement is that they download this form, sign it, and send it to you, and then you will allow them to do the survey. These are things that worry me at night.
I mean, I guess it would also waive their anonymity, right? It would waive their anonymity, and then if you're concerned about social desirability kinds of things too, I wonder. So I mean, and then there are trade-offs, right? Either way, I suppose.
So we've been a little lenient, I think, as far as letting people say, okay, put the informed consent information on the first page, and say, if you agree to be volunteer in the study and you are over 18 years of age, click and go to the next screen.
Right.
And we've been going with that model here, and I hope that's okay.
All right, well, on that note, why don't we give our panel a nice round of applause? 4:07, so I'll let everybody go. We can continue our conversation informally, but thank you very much for coming, and stay tuned for more events sponsored by the SSRMC and the Reeve Center. Thank you.